The Sky War over Europe wasn't just about bombs and factories, it was about belief. By 1943, the United States Army Air Force had built an entire strategy around a single idea: that daylight precision bombing could cripple Germany faster than any ground campaign ever could. Not terror raids, not area devastation, but targeted destruction, delivered by formations of heavy bombers so tightly packed they could defend themselves through sheer interlocking firepower. It was a clean theory, it made sense on paper, and it almost felt modern. The issue was, in the air, the enemy got a vote too. German fighter control, radar, black belts, and experienced intercept squadrons had been learning and adapting every time American bombers crossed the coast. What started as isolated attacks had become coordinated methods: timing, altitude, angles, massed passes designed to shear formations apart. And the deeper bombers went, the worse it became. That was the tension hanging over August 17th, 1943, the day the US tried to hit two of the most important targets in Germany in a single blow. Not because it was easy, but because if daylight bombing was ever going to work, it had to work here. The first target was Regensburg, where major Messerschmitt production was concentrated, particularly the fighter output Germany depended on to contest the skies. If you could disrupt that, you didn't just destroy buildings, you reduced the number of German fighters able to rise tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. The second target, Schweinfurt, was the ball bearing hub. Now, ball bearings are the kind of component you don't notice until they're gone. They're not glamorous, they don't roar like engines or explode like shells, but they sit inside almost everything that moves. Aircraft engines, tank transmissions, machine tools, industrial motors. When they stop flowing, production doesn't slow down in one dramatic collapse. It chokes, it jams, it fails in 100 quiet places until the whole machine begins to shudder and seize. To the planners, Schweinfurt represented a pressure point, a single place whose destruction might ripple through the entire German economy. So the plan was drafted with brutal ambition: hit both on the same day. And to make it even more daring, they didn't just want to hit them. They wanted to outsmart Germany's defenses while doing it. One bomber force would hit Regensburg, then continue all the way south to North Africa. No return to England, no turning around, a one-way raid across enemy territory with fuel calculations that left no room for detours, no room for mistakes, and absolutely no room for panic. The second force would hit Schweinfurt and return to England. This split was meant to scatter German fighters, intercept one stream and the other might slip through, or at least reach the target with less pressure. But there was a fatal problem sewn right into the idea. Escort fighters didn't have the range. Over the channel and into France, the bombers would have cover. But once they pushed deeper, the escorts would peel away, forced by fuel to turn back. Past that invisible line, the bombers would be alone. If the Luftwaffe chose to commit to the fight, and they would, the bombers would have to endure hours of continuous attack. Not a battle, something closer to a grind. This wasn't a raid where crews woke up, climbed in, and went. It began in the cold, half-light, with the kind of quiet that feels unnatural when you're surrounded by engines and bombs. Ground crews moved with practiced urgency. Bombs were loaded and locked. Ammunition belts were fed into guns. Fuel tanks were topped to the limit. The air smelled like exhaust, oil, and damp grass. Inside briefing rooms, men sat shoulder to shoulder as officers talked through routes and targets with the calm tone of people describing a map, not a killing field. Then the curtain came back. The red line stretched deep into Germany, further than most of them had flown. And for the Regensburg cruise, it didn't loop back. It just kept going. That detail mattered. It sat in the stomach like a stone. The navigator quickly ran through calculations again and again. The pilot flexed his fingers on the edge of a table, imagining the control column vibrating for 10 hours. A gunner checked his weapon, then checked it again, then sat with his hands in his lap as if holding them still to hold the day still too. A line from a veteran of the daylight campaign captured the mood. You didn't feel brave. You just didn't want to be the one who looked afraid. Takeoff wasn't the danger everyone feared most, but it was the first place the mission could kill you. B-17s climbed heavy and slow, wheels tucking in as they gained altitude in wide spirals over England, assembling into massive formations. This wasn't a clean parade in the sky. It was crowded, hence flying, where a tiny misjudgment could clip a wingtip and send two bombers into a spinning fireball. Pilots held their place by reference points, a tail, a wing, a number painted on a fuselage. The formation tightened until planes were close enough to make out crew silhouettes through windows. Once assembled, the true environment of the mission set in. Cold seeped in at altitude like water through cracks. Oxygen masks went on. Voices became clipped through intercoms. The aircraft felt smaller, louder, more alive. An industrial creature made of aluminum and vibration. Below, the English coast appeared, and then passed. The channel opened beneath them, gray water, faint ship wakes, scattered clouds. For a short moment, it was almost peaceful. The kind of peace that feels like the world holding its breath. Then, France appeared, and with its first signs that the mission was no longer theory, black bursts began as distant puff, black dots hanging harmlessly far below. Then they started to creep upward. The German gunners weren't firing to hit at first. They were measuring, adjusting, finding the altitude and the drift. The formation pressed on. Inside one bomber, a crewman watched through a side window as bursts stepped closer, like someone walking across the sky with a measuring tape. The plane shuddered as a nearby explosion punched the air around it. You could feel it in your teeth, a crack of metal, sharp and sudden, somewhere behind the cockpit. A new draft appeared instantly, colder than the rest. A crewman looked down and saw a neat hole through the fuselage skin, daylight shining through it like an accusation. Still flying, still intact, not yet. Then the first fighters appeared, small, dark shapes at altitude, approaching with a confidence that felt personal. They didn't swarm immediately. They assessed, they positioned, and the moment they committed, the sky changed from empty to crowded in seconds. The opening passes were fast and violent. A fighter came in head-on, cannon flashes blinking like camera shutters. Tracers ripped past the cockpit, white streaks that felt too close to be real. A gunner swung his weapon, fired in short bursts, and watched the fighter vanish past the formation at a speed that made the mind lag behind the eyes. Then another, and another. The bomber held course because it had to. Formation discipline wasn't pride, it was protection. The guns overlapped. The boxes covered each other. Any aircraft that drifted too far became isolated. And isolation in enemy airspace wasn't a situation. It was a death sentence. Inside the bomber, the sound became constant. Engines, gunfire, intercom callouts, the dull thump of flak in the distance. Men moved with a stiff economy of people trying not to waste strength, trying not to waste luck. The mission was only beginning. Germany lay ahead. And somewhere, far beyond the horizon, the formations would split, each one heading toward a target that would demand its own price. The split didn't happen with drama. No flair, no announcement over the radio that everyone could hear. It happened the way huge things often happen in war, quietly, mechanically, with men doing their jobs while trying not to think about what the job truly meant. One mass of bombers held course toward Schweinfurt. The other began to peel away toward the southeast, Regensburg. And for those crews, the mission wasn't just go in, bomb, come home. It was go in, bomb, and then keep going. South, over mountains, across more hostile airspace, toward a landing strip in North Africa that might feel like salvation, or might not feel like anything at all if they didn't make it. Once the formation turned, the geography of the war shifted under them. Familiar escape routes vanished. The long, open skies between them and the target felt like an ocean with no lifeboats. Now, the idea behind this double strike was to confuse German defenses. Two bomber streams, two directions, two targets. But radar plots, observers, radio relays, controllers with grease pencils, and practice voices. The split caused a momentary hesitation. Then the system corrected. Fighter groups were retasked, interception points were updated. The Luftwaffe didn't need to guess where the bombers were going. They needed to kill enough of them before they got there. And now, the Regensburg force was presenting a clean problem to solve. A big formation pushing southeast, far from escorts, committed to a route that couldn't change easily. German pilots climbed into position, like hunters climbing into trees ahead of a path they knew the prey had to follow. Meanwhile, up in the bombers, the attacks came in a rhythm that felt unnatural, like the sky itself had learned how to strike. A fighter would appear, flash through, and disappear. Then another would replace it almost immediately, as if the air was producing them. Some attacks came from above, diving with speed and gravity on their side. Others came from below, where the bomber's belly, its blind underside, was always more vulnerable than crews wanted to admit. And then there were the worst ones, head-on passes. From a distance, a fighter was a speck. Then it was a shape. Then it was a windshield, a spinning prop, flashes at the wing. The closing speed was so high that the mind barely processed it as an event. It felt more like a collision that either happened or it didn't. A nose gunner leaned into his sight, sweating inside freezing air, trying to lead a target that was sprinting straight at him. He fired a short burst, corrected, fired again. The fighter flashed past so close it seemed to tear the air open. And for a fraction of a second, he saw the pilot's head. Then nothing, just empty space where death had been. The bomber shuddered. A jagged hole appeared in the nose plexiglass. Cold air knifed through the compartment, turning sweat into ice. The gunner didn't look at the hole for more than a heartbeat. There was always another fighter. Every crew understood something deeply by this point. Bravery wasn't the deciding factor anymore. Discipline was. Formation was life, not because it made them invincible, but because it made them harder to pick apart. The gunners' fields of fire overlapped. The boxes supported one another. A lone bomber was a slow animal separated from the herd. Easy to circle, easy to hammer, easy to finish. So pilots held position with aching hands, fighting turbulence and damage and instinct. They stayed straight when they wanted to swerve. They stayed level when they wanted to dive. The stress was constant, not cinematic, grinding, like carrying a weight that never shifted. And this was still only the approach. Regensburg was ahead. Black belts were ahead. The bomb run was ahead. Fighters were terrifying because they were alive, because you could see intent in their motion. Black was terrifying because it wasn't. It was mathematic. The formation pushed deeper, the black bursts became thicker. The German gunners were good, very good. Their shells burst at altitude and filled space with steel fragments that didn't care about courage, experience, or prayer. A burst would go off close enough that the bomber seemed to punch downward. The intercom crackled with sudden shouting. An engine tone changed slightly, subtle, but every man could hear it. A second burst, closer. A third. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like handcuffs of nails thrown at speed. Somewhere in the aircraft, a line ruptured and a mist filled the air. A brief, ghostly cloud of fluid that vanished into the slipstream. Then came the worst kind of sound. Silence where something used to be. A gun that had been firing stopped. A voice on the intercom went quiet. A bomber off the left wing began to drift. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. Its altitude bled away. No sharp dive, no explosion, just the slow sag of an aircraft losing the argument with physics. Fighters saw it instantly. They turned toward it as if pulled by gravity itself. As Regensburg neared, the pressure compressed into something almost unbearable. The Luftwaffe didn't need to stop the bombers completely. They only needed to weaken them, thin the formation, break the cohesion, force mistakes. Because once the bomb run began, the bombers would have to fly straight and level, predictable, vulnerable. The closer they came, the more the men inside needed each aircraft. The cramped compartments, the cold biting fingers, the aching shoulders from bracing against turbulence, the strange taste in the mouth from hours of oxygen and fear. A crewman glanced at the clock and felt disbelief. It seemed impossible that only a few hours had passed. The mission felt like it had already been an entire day of fighting. Then, the target area was there. You didn't always see the factories first. You saw the flak. The bomb bay doors still opened, and the aircraft instantly felt wrong. Like a solid thing had become hollow. Cold air surged through openings. The bomber vibrated differently. The pilot fought the controls with small corrections, knowing every correction mattered. And now the formation's job changed. This wasn't survival by evasion. This was survival by stubbornness. They had to hold a straight line through the most heavily defended portion of the route. They had to keep altitude and spacing while shells burst around them. They had to pretend their aircraft was not being shaken like a tin can. The bombardier lay over his sight, eyes locked downwards, hands steady in a world that would not stop moving. Somewhere, a controller's voice called adjustments. Left, left, steady. Flak burst in clusters now. A bomber rocked hard enough that men slammed into frames. A shard tore through the fuselage and punched into equipment with a metallic scream. Another burst went off close enough to flash right through the windows, like someone setting off lightning in the air. Then, the release. Bombs dropped, not as individual objects, but as a sudden absence of weight. The aircraft rose slightly as if relieved. The bombs fell away in strings and patterns, tumbling toward the Messerschmitt works. Below, the first detonations walked across the complex, explosions blooming, roofs caving, smoke erupting and spreading outward like ink in water. It worked. For a brief moment, the crews had done what they came to do. And then, the next truth hit. The mission wasn't over. For Regensburg, bombs away didn't mean turn for home. It meant now you have to escape across half a continent. As the formation angled away from the target, crews searched the sky with desperate hope for friendly fighters. None came. Instead, German fighters returned. The Luftwaffe attacked again, and the timing was cruelly intelligent. Bombers were in a loosening formation after the bomb run, reorganizing, dealing with damage, checking wounded men. Those moments of reorientation created small gaps, and these gaps were invitation. A fighter latched onto the rear of a bomber that couldn't keep up and hammered it. Tracers stitched the fuselage. The bomber jolted, then began to burn. Not a movie fireball, but a slow, lethal fire that spread along metal and fabric, creeping into places crews could not reach. The pilot tried to hold altitude. The engine coughed, the bomber fell behind, and a few seconds later, it was gone into cloud and smoke. And the formation kept going because stopping would only create more death. Inside another bomber, a waist gunner fired until his barrel heat shimmered. His arms vibrated with recoil. He felt oddly distant from his own body, like he was watching himself in a narrow tunnel of vision. A line of cannon fire passed through his compartment and punched holes in the opposite wall. The sound was not a bang, but a ripping, a tearing crash, like the aircraft was being unzipped. He didn't scream, he didn't even really flinch. He just shifted his stance and kept firing because there was no other action available. A later remark from one crew captured this exact numb intensity. After a while, you stopped thinking of dying. You started thinking about keeping the plane together. Hours into the mission, the terrain began to change beneath them. The land rose, the world hardened into ridges and shadows. The Alps waited like a final barrier, beautiful from a distance, indifferent up close. For aircraft already damaged, already struggling, climbing over mountains was not just another leg. It was a test with no reset. Engines strained thinner air. Temperatures dropped further. Oxygen systems had to keep working. Navigation had to be exact. A bomber with one engine could sometimes limp on over flatland. Over mountains, that margin shrank. The crews didn't talk about it out loud, but you could feel it in the way they watched the gauges, in the way every man listened for a change in the engine note, like a doctor listening for a heartbeat. Because if they couldn't make the mountains, there would be nowhere safe to go. And if they did make the mountains, they still had to make it to North Africa. They still had to land, and they still had to survive. When the Regensburg force peeled away to the southeast, the remaining bomber stream felt the air change around it. The formation was still huge, still formidable, but it was no longer a single concentrated fist. It had become the second half of a plan, and the Germans understood what that meant. One stream had broken off, the other was still pressing east. If fighter control had hesitated, it didn't show now. The Luftwaffe adjusted like a machine shifting gears. More squadrons were vectored toward the Schweinfurt force. Interception points were laid out ahead of the bombers, not behind them. Instead of reacting, German fighters began to stage themselves, waiting at altitude, attacking in waves, then handing the bombers off to the next group further down the route. It meant the Schweinfurt formation didn't just face an attack, it faced a system. And because the escorts had turned back, there would be no friendly fighters to break that system apart. Only the bombers, only their guns, only their ability to keep formation while the sky itself tried to tear them apart. Hours into the mission, the strain became physical. Hands ached from gripping controls. Ears rang from the constant vibration. Oxygen masks turned breathing into a conscious act. Sweat froze inside gloves. Every man felt time slowing and speeding at once. Long stretches of nothing, followed by sudden bursts of terror that seemed to erase the minutes before them. Then fighters returned again. Head-on passes became frequent now, almost routine. This tactic was brutally effective. It reduced the time bombers' gunners had to track a target, and it sent cannon shells directly into the most fragile parts of the aircraft. Nose compartments, cockpits, forward fuselage. Despite this, the formation held because it had to. And as Schweinfurt neared, the atmosphere became claustrophobic. Not inside the bombers, but in the sky itself. The airspace filled with threats, black flak bursts, darting fighters, distant smoke from earlier hits. The bomber boxes pressed onward, engines droning with a steadiness that felt almost mocking compared to the chaos outside. This was the point where crews realized the worst part wasn't the fear, it was the inevitability. On approach, you could not win the way a fighter pilot might win a dogfight. You could only keep going forward and hope your aircraft stayed intact long enough to drop bombs and turn away. And even then, you still had to fly all the way back to England, with the Luftwaffe waiting to do it again. And just like over Regensburg, above Schweinfurt, bomb bay doors opened. Aircraft once again instantly felt unstable, like a solid body had been split open. As the bombers turned away from Schweinfurt, the formation began to loosen. It had to. Aircraft were damaged, some were slower, others struggled to hold altitude. Crews were dealing with wounded men, engine failures, malfunctioning oxygen system, broken hydraulics, and jammed guns. Those small disruptions created gaps, and gaps were exactly what German fighters wanted. They attacked again, this time with the cold patience of predators who knew the prey had already run too far. The return became a slow collapse of certainty. One engine out became two. A hydraulic leak became a dead control surface. A wounded crewman became still, slumped against the wall with frost forming on his mouth. Bombers dropped out of formation one by one. Sometimes they fell in flames. Sometimes they simply disappeared into clouds and were never seen again. And as always, the remaining crews kept going because stopping meant joining them. The Channel was still far away. England was still far away. And the Luftwaffe could keep cycling attacks, refueling, and returning, while the bombers could only carry their damage forward like a debt. Finally, hours later, the French coast appeared. Flak still followed them toward it. Fighters attacked until fuel, orders, or exhaustion pulled them away. And then, over water, the sky began to empty. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. Not peaceful silence, the silence of survival, when your body realizes you're still alive and doesn't know what to do with that fact. In scattered formations, ragged and reduced, the surviving bombers crossed the Channel. England rose beneath them. Runways appeared, and one by one, aircraft began to land, some cleanly, some barely, some crashing at the edge of safety as if the plane itself had held together only until it could no longer see enemy territory. The fighting ended over the Channel, but the mission didn't truly end until the numbers came in. Back on the English airfields, there was a ritual to it. Crews and ground staff watching the sky, counting distant specks, trying to match silhouettes to squadron markings. Each returning bomber was a small surge of relief, followed immediately by the next thought. Who isn't here yet? Because on days like this, the empty spaces were louder than engines. Hours after the planned return times, people were still standing around hard stands and dispersal points, scanning clouds that offered nothing back. Some men kept looking long after they'd accepted the truth, because looking gave them something to do besides think. In North Africa, the same process happened in a different atmosphere. Sunlight, dust, unfamiliar runways, but the same grim arithmetic. Bombers landed, battered and limping, crews stumbling out and staring at their own aircraft like they couldn't believe it had brought them that far. And then came the counting. Not only aircraft, but names. The Schweinfurt Regensburg mission cost the US Army Air Forces dozens of heavy bombers destroyed and hundreds more damaged in a single day. The exact numbers mattered, commanders lived by them, but the meaning mattered more. This was a loss rate that could not be endured repeatedly without hollowing out the bomber force. It wasn't just the aircraft, it was the crews. A heavy bomber didn't fly because it existed. It flew because the men worked as a single system. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineers, gunners. When one bomber failed to return, it wasn't a plane missing. It was human beings gone from the roster. Some killed in the air, some burned, some drowned, some parachuted into the fields and were captured, their war continuing behind wire. And everyone still standing on the runway understood the part that wasn't spoken. The next mission would be flown by men who had watched friends fail to return. That changes you, even if you're still breathing. Survivors didn't return like heroes in a parade. They returned quiet, Some joked the moment they stepped out because the brain does strange things when it survives something it was sure it wouldn't. Others sat on the ground with their backs against the tires and stared at nothing, hands trembling only after the danger was gone. Debriefings became a kind of controlled chaos, officers asking for flak altitudes, fighter angles, engine issues, bomb impact, crews trying to describe hours of terror in clean sentences. Some men couldn't remember sequences clearly, others remembered everything too clearly. A gunner might talk about firing until his arms went numb. A pilot might describe holding formation while watching another aircraft disintegrate in his peripheral vision. A navigator might admit that halfway through the return, he stopped feeling the plane was moving forward at all, like it was stuck inside the same violent patch of sky forever. Did they hit their targets though? Yes. Regensburg was struck hard. Bombing disrupted aircraft production, damaged infrastructure, and forced emergency repair work. It mattered. It slowed output. It created headaches for German planners who needed fighters immediately. Schweinfurt was also hit. Ball bearing plants were damaged heavily. Buildings shattered, fires started, machinery wrecked. But here's the thing about industrial warfare: a factory is not only a building, it's a network. Suppliers, stockpiles, repair capacity, spare machines, alternate sites, improvisation. Germany didn't simply stop producing ball bearings because Schweinfurt was bombed. They adjusted, they dispersed production, they ran shifts around the clock, they prioritized military allocation, they used reserves, they rerouted what they could. And while output suffered, it did not collapse in the clean, decisive way the Allies had hoped. The mission had proven the targets were vulnerable, but it had also proven that Germany could absorb punishment, at least in the short term, without instantly losing the ability to fight. This was the real shockwave of Schweinfurt Regensburg. Not whether bombs landed, not whether smoke rose, but whether the US daylight bombing strategy could continue as planned. The doctrine had promised that tight bomber formations, bristling with guns, could defend themselves deep in enemy territory. What happened instead was a case study in limits. German fighters had attacked intelligently, especially through frontal passes that reduced the bombers' defensive advantage. Flak forced predictable routes near targets. Damage compounded over hours. Formation gaps opened. Stragglers were finished off. And the most important factor of all was the simplest: no escorts. Without long range fighters to contest the airspace, the bombers were trapped in a one sided war of endurance. Germany could throw fighters in waves, rotate squadrons, and keep the pressure up. The bombers could only absorb damage until they couldn't. If the US kept flying missions that deep at those loss rates, the bomber force would bleed itself dry. Commanders knew it, crews knew it, even men far above the mission, those measuring the war in tonnage and output charts, couldn't ignore what the mission had revealed. The daylight campaign reached a boundary it couldn't cross with tools it currently had. Schweinfurt Regensburg ended as a mission on August 17th, 1943, but as a message, it lasted the rest of the war. Because the raid forced the American Daylight Campaign to face a hard truth. You could reach deep Germany, and you could even hit what you aimed at, but you could not do it repeatedly without paying a price that would eventually destroy the bomber force itself. The question wasn't whether the crews were brave enough. They were. The question was whether the strategy was sustainable. After that day, the answer looked like no. In the weeks that followed, the US continued bombing, but decisions now carried a new caution. Routes, altitude, timing, everything was reconsidered. Commanders who had believed in the bomber will always get through now had to add a second sentence, but at what cost? The raid had shown that German defenses were not simply strong, they were organized. Fighter control could cycle squadrons, black belts could force predictable behavior. The Luftwaffe didn't need to win a single decisive battle in the sky. It could just keep striking until the bombers couldn't bear it anymore. And it wasn't just tactics, it was endurance. A bomber limping home with one engine out, hole through the fuselage, men wounded in their stations. That aircraft might make it back once, maybe twice, but mental fatigue, missing veterans, damaged airframes, and the quiet erosion of confidence all add up. War isn't only fought in explosions, it's fought in how long a force can keep doing the same thing before it collapses. Schweinfurt Regensburg was a warning that the US was approaching that cliff. It's tempting to think of this mission as a tragedy in isolation, a day of enormous loss, followed by adjustment and continuation. But its true place in history is sharper than that. Schweinfurt Regensburg was one of the moments when the Allies realized that bombing wasn't simply about factories, it was about controlling the sky. Because if you can't protect the bombers, you can't keep the pressure on the enemy. And if you can't keep the pressure on the enemy, you can't weaken their ability to resist an invasion. So the mission became part of a larger sequence. Big raids prove bombing can hurt Germany. Deep raids prove bombing alone is too costly. Escort development becomes urgent. Air superiority becomes the objective. And once air superiority is achieved, Germany's ability to fight a modern war begins to unravel. In that sense, Schweinfurt Regensburg didn't win anything directly, but it helped shape the air campaign that eventually made victory possible. And for the men inside the bombers, that's the cruelest truth. They weren't just flying missions, they were paying the entry fee for a strategy that hadn't finished evolving yet. Picture the last bombers crossing back over the channel, ragged, reduced, scattered. The formation that left England as a confident mass returned as something altered. Aircraft were missing, wings were patched with holes, engines ran rough, men were silent, exhausted, staring at nothing. And yet they landed, not because the day had been fair, but because they had refused to stop. Not heroism as a poster, but heroism as endurance, doing the job, holding the line, bringing the plane home with hands that wouldn't stop shaking until hours later. That's what the Schweinfurt Regensburg mission ultimately was, a day that proved what American air power could do, and a day that proved what it would cost.